Nepal, a country of mountains, temples, and deep spiritual traditions. But beyond the beauty, there are experiences people don't easily explain. Stories that aren't meant to scare, but somehow do. These are real accounts, shared by ordinary people from different parts of Nepal. And tonight, you're about to hear 3 of them. Make sure you're alone, because these stories feel very different in the dark. Let's begin. Story 1. The Last Bus from Kakani. This story was shared by a man named Suresh, who was a college student at the time. It happened in 2018. Suresh had gone to Kakani with a few friends. By the time they were returning, it had already gotten late. His friends managed to leave earlier, but Suresh stayed behind longer than planned. He missed the regular buses, so when the last bus heading toward Kathmandu arrived, he got on without thinking twice. Inside, and the bus was almost empty. There were only 3 other passengers. An old man sitting near the front, a woman with her head covered, sitting in the middle, and a man at the very back, staring out the window. No one spoke. Suresh took a seat halfway down the aisle. The bus started moving. At first, everything felt normal. Just the sound of the engine, rain tapping against the windows, and the headlights cutting through the dark, winding road. But after a few minutes, something began to feel off. The woman sitting ahead of him hadn't moved at all, not even slightly, not during the sharp turns, not when the bus hit bumps. Nothing. Suresh tried to ignore it. Then, the old man near the front slowly turned his head and looked directly at him. Their eyes met for a brief second, and for some reason, Suresh felt an immediate sense of discomfort, so he looked away. Minutes passed. Then he noticed something else. The man sitting at the back was no longer there. Suresh was sure he hadn't seen him get off. There had been no stop, no sound of the door opening. He turned slightly, trying to check again. The seat was empty. At this point, his heartbeat started to pick up. He looked toward the front. The old man was still there. The woman still hadn't moved. The bus continued deeper into the dark road. Then, suddenly, the bus came to a base. Stop. No bus stop. No houses nearby. Just forest. The driver didn't say anything. The door opened. The old man stood up and walked off the bus, without a word. As he stepped down, Suresh noticed something that made his stomach drop. The ground outside was muddy from the rain, but the old man's feet left no footprints. Suresh froze. The door closed again. The bus started, moving. Now it was just him and the woman. He tried not to look at her, but after a few seconds, he couldn't help it. Slowly, he leaned forward, and that's when he realized her face wasn't visible at all. Not because of the shawl, but because there was nothing there. No features, no eyes, no nose, just a dark, empty space where her face should have been. Suresh immediately stood up and shouted for the driver to stop. The bus halted abruptly. He ran out without looking back. When he finally reached a nearby shop down the road and explained what happened, the shopkeeper went silent. Then he said something Suresh still remembers clearly. That bus route had a fatal accident years ago, late at night, with only a few passengers on. Story 2. The Room on the Top Floor. This story comes from a woman named Akriti, who moved to Kathmandu for her studies. It happened in 2021. She had rented a room in an old house near Balaju. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed normal. The only unusual thing was that the house had 4 floors, but the top floor was always locked. Akriti didn't think much of it at first. Her room was on the 3rd floor. It was small, but clean. The first few days went by without any problems, until one night, around 1:30 a.m., she woke up suddenly. At first, she didn't know why. Then, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from above her ceiling. That didn't make sense. The top floor was supposed to be locked. She sat up in meth bed, listening carefully. The footsteps continued, back and forth, as if someone was walking across the room directly above her. She tried to ignore it, thinking maybe she was imagining things. But then, it stopped. Complete silence. And just as she was about to lie back down, she heard something else. A dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. That night, she barely slept. The next morning, she asked the landlord about the top floor. He looked slightly uncomfortable. Then he said it was just used for storage and no one goes there. Akriti didn't mention the sounds. She told herself it was probably old. Wood, or maybe animals. But the next night, it happened again. This time, louder, the same footsteps, the same dragging sound, except now, it was closer, right above her, and then 3 slow knocks, directly on her ceiling. She froze. Her entire body went cold. She didn't respond. She didn't move. A few seconds later, 3 more knocks, this time harder. Akriti grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She stared at the ceiling. Nothing. The knocking stopped, but she didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, she decided to talk to one of the other tenants living on the ground floor, an older woman. When Akriti mentioned the noises, the woman immediately told her to be careful. Then she revealed something disturbing. Years ago, the landlord's daughter had lived on that top floor. She had been mentally unwell. One night, neighbors reported hearing loud noises, furniture being dragged, and repeated knocking. The next morning, she was found dead inside that room. Since then, no one had stayed there. Akriti felt uneasy, but she still wasn't fully convinced. Until the 3rd night. That night, the sounds started earlier than usual. The footsteps, the dragging. But this time, something changed. The noise didn't stay above her. It moved, from the ceiling to the walls, slowly, as if whatever was making the sound was crawling down. Akriti sat frozen, staring at the corner of her room. Then she heard it clearly. 3 knocks. Not on the ceiling this time, but on her wall, right beside her bed. She slowly turned her head and whispered, "Who's there?" There was no answer, just silence. Then, after a few seconds, 3 knocks again, but this time from inside her room, right behind her. Akriti didn't turn around. She didn't check. She grabbed her keys, ran out of the room, and spent the rest of the night outside. The next morning, she moved out, immediately. To this day, she refuses to go near that house, and she says one thing still bothers her the most. When she left that night, she could still hear it, following her. 3 slow knocks. The voice from the river. This story was shared by a man named Ramesh, a local from a village near the Koshi River. It happened in 2016. Ramesh worked as a driver, often traveling late at night between small towns and villages. One evening, after dropping off a passenger, he was heading back home alone. It was already past midnight. The road he was driving on ran alongside the river for several kilometers. There were no streetlights, no houses nearby, just the sound of flowing water and the occasional wind moving through the trees. Ramesh had driven that route many times before. He wasn't easily scared, but that night, something felt different. About halfway through the road, he noticed something unusual. There was a woman standing near the edge of the road, alone, wearing a white dress. Her hair was long, covering most of her face. At that hour, in that area, it didn't make sense. Ramesh slowed the vehicle. For a moment, he considered not stopping. But then, he thought maybe she needed help. So he pulled over. He rolled down the window slightly and asked if everything was okay. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, facing slightly away from him. Ramesh felt a strange hesitation. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed toward the river. Still without saying a word, Ramesh followed her gesture. The river was dark, the current strong. He looked back at her. "Do you need help?" he asked again. This time, she spoke. Her voice was very soft, almost like a whisper. "Someone is calling from the water." Ramesh felt a chill run down his spine. He listened carefully. At first, he heard nothing except the river. Then, faintly, he heard it. A voice, calling out. It sounded like someone struggling, as if they were drowning. "Help! Help!" Ramesh's instincts kicked in. Without thinking too much, he stepped out of the vehicle. He grabbed his flashlight and moved closer to the riverbank. The voice became clearer, desperate, panicked. He scanned the water with the light. Nothing. Just the fast-moving current. But the voice was still there, calling for help. He moved closer, carefully stepping over rocks and mud. The ground was slippery. Still no one. Now he started to feel confused. Where was the voice coming from? He turned back slightly to call the woman, but she was gone, completely gone. There was nowhere she could have walked to that quickly. The road was empty. Ramesh's heart began to race. He turned, back toward the river. The voice had stopped. Everything was silent again, too silent. Then, suddenly, right behind him, he heard it again. "Help me." This time, it was much closer, right next to his ear. Ramesh spun around. No one was there. At that moment, his flashlight flickered and went out. He was standing in complete darkness. The only sound now was the dead river, loud, aggressive, almost overwhelming. Ramesh tried to stay calm. He reached for his phone, turned on the light, and quickly made his way back toward the road. As he stepped away from the riverbank, he heard something that made him freeze. Footsteps. Behind him, matching his pace. Step, step, step. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. He started walking again. The footsteps followed. Closer this time. He didn't turn around. He couldn't. Every instinct in his body told him not to. He reached his vehicle, got inside, and locked the doors immediately. His hands were shaking as he started the engine. And just as he was about to drive away, he saw something in the rearview mirror. The woman, sitting in the back seat, her head tilted slightly, hair still covering her face. Ramesh froze. He hadn't opened the door. There was no way she could have gotten in. Slowly, very slowly, her head lifted, and for the first time, he saw her face. It was pale, completely drenched, as if she had come straight out of the river. Her eyes were wide open, unblinking, and her mouth stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then she spoke, not in a whisper this time, but clearly, right behind him. You heard it too. Ramesh didn't respond. He couldn't. He slammed the accelerator and drove as fast as he could. He didn't look back. He didn't check the mirror again. After what felt like forever, he finally reached a small roadside tea shop that was still open. He stopped the vehicle and jumped out. People there immediately noticed something was wrong. He was pale, sweating, shaking. When he finally managed to explain what happened, the shop owner went quiet. Then he told him something that locals in that area already knew. Over the years, several people had drowned in that part of the pass river, some by accident, some under unclear circumstances, and occasionally, drivers passing late at night would report hearing voices, calling for help. Sometimes they would stop. Sometimes they would follow the sound, and a few never came back. Ramesh never drove that road at night again. In fact, he avoided that entire route completely. But even now, years later, there's one thing he says he can't forget. That voice. Not the one from the river, but the one inside his car. Because it didn't sound desperate. It didn't sound like it needed help. It sounded like it was waiting. These were 3 disturbing real experiences from Nepal. No exaggeration. No fiction. Just moments that people lived through and never fully understood. So, tonight, if you hear something, calling your name, or knocking, or asking for help, think twice before you respond. Because not everything that calls out should be answered.